Alright guys, believe it or not, we are now at the end of Unit 4, and we're going to move away from Africa and Asia and focus now on Latin America. And we're going to focus heavily on America, specifically the United States of America, and their involvement in imperialism here. I tell you, I am very happy to be done with imperialism. It's not that I don't like the topic, I do. I just really can't wait to get to World War I, which is our next topic. I find that one fascinating. Anyhow, let's get into this. Again, we are going to finish up the unit today by looking at Latin America and how we as a country in the United States were affecting them. We're going to begin by looking at a pretty famous island in the Caribbean called Cuba. And our involvement in Cuba is going to help spark a war between us and the Spanish. And why is Cuba important to us? You might ask the question. Well, let's look at the map. It's really close. It's about 90 miles from the Florida Keys to Cuba. I mean, it's really, really close. So what happens here can certainly have an impact on America. And also, today, in terms of Americans, there are a lot of Cuban Americans who live, particularly in Florida, southern Florida. So, it's important for that reason as well. Now, what country actually colonized Cuba? Well, what do they speak in Cuba? They speak Spanish, right? So the Spanish, Spain, had colonized Cuba, and they colonized Cuba way back. I mean, we're talking like the days of Christopher Columbus, hundreds of years ago. And so by the late 1800s, after almost 4 centuries of Spanish rule, Cuban nationalists are like, okay, Spain, time to go home, get out of here. And they launch a war, the 10-year war, a rebellion against Spanish rule, but they were unsuccessful. And the Spanish really fought back using some pretty brutal measures. And that brutality got a lot of attention in America. We were kind of like, hey, Spain, what are you doing down there? I'll give you an example of some of the images here, right? So these are Spain's work. These are people stuck in a Spanish prison camp. And I mean, just really horrifying stuff. And so if America wants Spain to behave in Cuba, and by the way, let me back up, it's not just a humanitarian thing. There are also a lot of Americans who had invested in Cuba. They owned farms or railroads or whatever, and so they don't want to see their money lost in any type of rebellion. So we've got to get Spain to kind of calm things down a little bit. So the theory was that America should show off its might. And so a battleship called the USS Maine was sent down to Havana, the capital city of Cuba. Now, officially, the battleship was there to basically help evacuate Americans in case another war were to break out in Cuba. But it's also there as kind of, again, a show of strength that, hey, Spain, just quit messing around. And what happens, spectacularly, is on February 15th, 1898, the Maine blows up. Okay, kaboom, right? 261 Americans are killed. Americans were absolutely furious because we came to the conclusion very quickly that it must have been the Spanish who did this, right? They planted a bomb under the ship or something like that. And we go ahead and declare war in April of 1898. Now, it's important to note that the Spanish denied any involvement, which, you would expect them to do that anyways. But also, it turns out, based on forensic evidence and studies that were done years after the fact, that probably what this was not an external explosion. It was probably an internal explosion. In other words, it was probably an accident that, America basically accidentally blew up its own ship, in other words. So Spain probably has no actual blame in this. But we weren't interested in that. We were interested in revenge, to punish the Spanish for what they've done. Because you can see here, Spain's a big monster, and they've killed our sailors, and we're ready to punch them in the face and all that. Remember the Maine was the big slogan. Remember the Maine. The Maine was, the battleship that was blown up. Here we are. We're going to shoot the King of Spain. Retribution basically means revenge, right? So this brings us to the Spanish-American War. And you're like, wait a minute, didn't we just talk about the Spanish-American War? And yes, we did. This is how America gained the Philippine Islands, which, by the way, I'll have you know, is nowhere near Cuba, right? So this is a war right here between us and Spain, and we're like, hey, let's go take this while we're at it. But our main focus for today is right here in Cuba. Also, as a little bit of a note here, Puerto Rico also becomes American property because of this war. Okay, so let's talk about the war. It is a very brief war. One of our American diplomats famously called it a splendid little war, right? Very few American casualties, maybe less than 1,000 Americans. In fact, I think it's actually less than 500 Americans die in this war, and many of them actually from disease, not combat. But there are a few battles, and in one of them, the charge up San Juan Hill, actually it was Kettle Hill, but that's okay. This creates a hero. You can see him on horseback right here. This is none other than Theodore Roosevelt, one of my big heroes. I really think Teddy Roosevelt's a pretty awesome guy. And this is the moment where he goes from being just kind of like a regional name to a national hero. Like everyone knows Teddy Roosevelt because of his troops called the Rough Riders. These were volunteers who went to fight in this war. Now, as a result of this brief war, only 4 months, America, as we've talked about, gains Puerto Rico, gains the Philippines, and gains a piece of Cuba called Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay right here. So this little thing right down here, America still to this day owns. It's a naval base. And this was, very awkward during the Cold War because, as we're going to find out later, Cuba becomes a communist country. We didn't much care for communists during the Cold War, as you probably know. And so for us, having a little piece of their country definitely made things a little tense. There's just an overview of a part of Guantanamo Bay, this little piece of Cuba that America owns. And this right here, it's probably really hard to see on your screen, but you'll notice there's a little bit of red and yellow. It's the only McDonald's on Cuban soil. It's on the naval base that America owns, Guantanamo Bay. All right, now, so we took Puerto Rico, we took the Philippines, we took Guantanamo Bay. What about Cuba as a whole? And we had made it pretty clear that this was a war we were going to fight against Spain, not to gain Cuba, but to to help Cuba gain independence from Spain. So Cuba does become officially independent. However, there are some strings attached. There's this thing called the Platt Amendment, which was put in this new Cuban constitution, which basically said America kind of interfere in Cuban affairs. We kind of have like final say in what Cuba does. So officially independent, but definitely limited independence, I think we'll say. It's not. I wouldn't quite call Cuba an American puppet, but it's pretty darn close. Going forward after this moment. Now, extending this further in terms of America's role in the Caribbean, a guy named Teddy Roosevelt, we just talked about him, he becomes president after the assassination of William McKinley, and as president, he is going to put forward this new idea called the Roosevelt Corollary. Now, a corollary is just an extension of an existing idea, and this is extending something called the Monroe Doctrine, which you learned about in 8th grade. And the Monroe Doctrine had said that basically Europeans should kind of stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Like, don't build colonies over here anymore. We will take care of the Western Hemisphere. And Roosevelt's going beyond that to calling America an international police power in the Western Hemisphere. In other words, America is going to be kind of the big brother who's going to look over the entire Western Hemisphere. That's North and South America and the Caribbean, and be kind of the final say of what happens here. This is, of course, a power that we gave ourselves and not something that other countries in the Western Hemisphere much cared for, as you can probably imagine. Because from their perspective, it makes us sound really nosy and kind of interfering all the time. And interfere we will. Okay, you can see examples of American action here, along those lines of the Roosevelt Corollary. We're going to get involved in all kinds of different areas, sending in troops. You can see the years, right? American troops sent in and again and again and again. All right, one last big topic, guys. This is another example of U.S. imperialism, sort of. It's called the Panama Canal. So before we get into how the Panama Canal was built, let's figure out why it was built. And, well, it's the same reason the Suez Canal was built. It saves a lot of time, right? There's the canal. What this does is it dramatically shortens the distance between one side of North America and the other. Right? So instead of going all the way through here, you can go now right through there. Now, this picture, I think, definitely tells us there are going to be some problems building the Panama Canal. Notice how death is waiting on us in Panama. And, of course, the number one will be disease. This is in a tropical environment, a lot of tropical diseases down there. And, in fact, the French tried to build a canal across Panama first, and it failed. Over 20,000 workers died. And the French company went bankrupt, basically trying and failing to build this canal. And America sees an opportunity to pick up where the French left off. Now, the problem is, for us, for Americans anyways, is that Panama at the time was not an independent nation. It was actually part of a country called Colombia. So Colombia basically extended all the way up here. So if we want to finish the French Canal, we're going to have to basically ask Colombia to let us have this land, or at least let us buy the land from them. And so we offer up, hey, Colombia, we'll give you X number of dollars and all that stuff. And Colombia's like, no thanks, we don't want your money. Now you'll notice, let's go back to the map here. The capital of Colombia is Bogota. You can see that right there. And notice how Teddy Roosevelt is dumping dirt right on Bogota. And he's digging the canal, right? Which tells us maybe America is doing something a little shady, perhaps. So what happens is in 1903, there's a rebellion in Panama against Colombia. The Panamanians fighting for independence. Now, there's no direct evidence saying that America was like behind the scenes, necessarily like plotting this and all that kind of stuff. It's more so that America took advantage of kind of like an unfolding situation, this rebellion. And so America very quickly recognizes Panama as an independent country and uses military force to basically intimidate the Colombians into backing down so that Colombia can't reclaim Panama from its rebels. And so now that Panama's independence, America sees an opportunity to buy the land not from Colombia, but from this new country, Panama. So America offers up the money. We buy a 10-mile wide strip of land right across the Isthmus of Panama. So this right here, it was called the Canal Zone. And after 10 years and thousands of deaths, the canal was finally finished. Now, of course, you're putting a lot of money into building this canal. The question is, how do you earn that back? And you earn it through tolls. So ships, as they pass through, have to pay a fee, a toll, to pass through. And currently, the average toll is about 150 grand. To my understanding, the toll is based on basically how big your ship is. And so the bigger the ship, the more the toll. And this is something that America is going to continue to own all the way until 1999. In 1999, Panama received full control over the canal zone. And this was partly done, it was controversial at the time, and I guess it probably still is, but it was partly done because some Americans felt kind of guilty as to how we got this land. Supporting the Panamanian rebellion, did America cause that, all that stuff. And so we thought, well, we should probably hand the land back so we're not seen as an imperial power. There's the Panama Canal under construction. These are what we call locks, which allow ships to be raised and lowered because, Panama is not completely flat. There's differences in elevation, of course. And this is Teddy Roosevelt going down there to check on the progress. And this is the first time a president had left the United States while being president. First time he left the country, which was, kind of noteworthy, I guess we'll say. There is the Panama Canal, all the different locks. And for decades, the Panama Canal was, that was kind of like a standard width for ships. Like you wouldn't build one bigger than the Panama Canal because you couldn't go through it. And you can see how tight the squeeze is here. And then eventually ships did get big, so big that they couldn't go through the Panama Canal any longer. And this is why Panama's been spending lots of money and resources expanding their canal so that the giant like oil tankers and things can still go through the canal. All right, that is it, guys, for period 4. We've covered a lot of ground. We talked at the very beginning of this unit about what imperialism was, what motivated it. So look over those motivations. Look at how it affected different regions of the world. We began in Africa, and then we expanded outward to India, and then China and East Asia, and Southeast Asia, and Pacific, and now Latin America. So go back over and look at those topics. Kind of, again, just get your mind around what imperialism was, what caused it, and then what effects those causes had. In our next unit, we will begin one of my favorite topics the whole year. It's the First World War, and it is, again, I find it really, really interesting and fascinating. All right, that is it for Period 4, guys.